Bonjour, je m'appelle Sabri
Hello,
Adel Saadi
my name
et
is
je suis
Sabri
coordinateur
Adel Sadi, and
d'implémentation
I'm the
francophone
Francophone
au Centre de
Implementation
recherche
Coordinator
et
at the
d'éducation
Center
sur
for
la violence
Research and
contre les femmes
Education
et
on
les enfants
Violence
de
Against Women
l'Université
and
Western.
Children at Western
Au
University.
nom des équipes du Learning
On
Network et
behalf
du
of the
Centre
Learning
Vue
Network
d'Excellence,
and
je vous souhaite la
Knowledge Center
bienvenue
teams,
à notre
I would like to
webinaire
welcome
intitulé
you to our webinar
Améliorer la
called
pratique judiciaire
Enhancing
par
Judicial Practice
l'intégration du contrôle
by
coercitif,
Integrating Coercive
présenté par
Control,
Karine Barrette
presented
et
by
Marie-Jeanne
Karine
Graton.
Barrette and Marie-Jeanne Graton.
Je tiens à souligner que notre
I would like
travail
to point out that
se
our
déroule
work
sur les terres
takes place
traditionnelles
on the
des
traditional
nations
lands of
Anishinaabe,
the Anishinaabe,
Haudenosaunee, Lenapewak
Haudenosaunee,
et Tchonotone.
Lenapawak, and
Ces
Chonatan
terres
nations.
sont liées au
These
traité
lands
du
are
Pacte
linked to
Lambin
the
et de
London
Sambre
Township
de
and Sambre
1796
treaties of
et au pacte de la tradition du wampum
1796
faisant
and to the
référence
Wampum
au
Belt Pact,
concept du bol
which refers to
One
the
Serving Bowl.
concept of the one spoon bowl.
Nous faisons référence à cette reconnaissance des
We're making
territoires
this
pour contrer la
recognition
doctrine de la
of territories to
découverte
counter the
et
doctrine of
reconnaître les
discovery
terres de la
and to
sous-communauté.
recognize Aboriginal lands and
Nous
sovereignty.
reconnaissons aussi que
We
de
also
nombreuses personnes
recognize
noires
that
ont été
many Black
violemment
people
déplacées au
were
Canada
violently
lors de
displaced in
colonialisme
Canada as a
colonisateur
result of
et de
colonizing
l'esclavage.
colonialism and slavery.
Nous continuerons de collaborer
We
avec
will
les
continue
communautés
to
pour
work
lutter
with
contre le
communities to
colonialisme, le
combat
racisme,
colonialism,
les
anti-Black
entraînements et
racism,
d'autres formes
and
d'oppression
other
systématique
forms of
omniprésentes
oppression
au
that
Canada
remain pervasive in
qui entraînent
Canada
des
and that
répercussions
result in the
disproportionnées de la violence commise
disproportionate
sur les femmes,
impact
sur les
of
communautés opprimées.
gender-based violence on oppressed
En tant
communities.
que colon dans cet
As
espace
a
et
settler in this
reconnaissant les
space,
nombreux
I'm
avantages
grateful
potentiels,
to the
je
many
tiens à exprimer ma
benefits that I
gratitude envers Mère
derive
Terre
from it and
pour
would
les
like to
ressources que nous
express my
utilisons
gratitude to
et
Mother
rendre
Earth
hommage
for the
à tous les
resources we
peuples
use
des
and to pay
Premières
tribute
Nations,
to all of the
Métis
First Nations,
et
Métis,
Inuits
and
qui
Inuit
habitent cette
peoples
terre depuis au moins
who
10
have
000 ans.
inhabited this land for at least 15,000 years.
Avant de commencer, permettez-moi de vous
Before I
présenter Karine
begin,
Barrette et
allow me
Marie-Jeanne
to
Graton,
introduce
qui sont
Karen Barrett
avocates
and
et
Marie-Jeanne
responsables
Graton, who
du
are
projet
lawyers and
Améliorer
leaders
la
of their
pratique
project
judiciaire pour accroître la
Improving
sécurité
Judicial
contre les victimes
Practice
de violences
to
conjugales au
improve
sein
the
du
security
regroupement
of
des
women
maisons
for
pour
victims
familles
of
victimes de
family
violences.
violence at the Regroupement des
Karine
Maisons pour
Barrette,
femmes victimes de
membre de la
violences
barre du
conjugales.
Québec 2005,
Karine Barrett has
est
been a member of the
influenceur
Quebec
dans
Bar
sa
since
communauté,
2005, has over
particulièrement en
20
défense des
years
droits sociaux.
in her community,
Elle a
particularly in
également
defending
contribué
social
au
rights.
développement de la
She also
formation
contributed to
au
the
sein de la barre du
development of
Québec.
continuing
Grâce
education
à son
within the
rôle de
Quebec
chargée
Bar.
de projet,
In her
elle
role
a
as project
sensibilisé
manager,
et
she
formé plus
has
de 6
raised
000
awareness and trained over
socio-judiciaires,
6,000
notamment des
socio-judicial
policiers,
actors,
des
including
procureurs,
police
des avocats et
officers,
des juges
prosecutors,
d'administration
lawyers, and
pour les tribunaux
administrative judges
spécialisés en matière de
for
violences sexuelles
the
et
tribunal
sexistes.
specialized in the area
Marie-Jeanne
of
Graton,
sexual
membre
and
du barreau du
domestic
Québec
violence.
depuis 2008,
Marie-Jean
a
Graton has
travaillé
been a
comme
member of the
adjointe
bar
au
since
sein du
2018,
directeur des poursuites
worked as a
criminelles pénales à
prosecutor with the
Montréal,
Director of Criminal and
notamment
Penal
dans une équipe
Prosecutions in
spécialisée en
Montreal,
violence intrafamiliales.
notably in a team
Elle met à profit
specializing in
cette
domestic
expérience pour
violence.
renforcer la sécurité des femmes
She uses
victimes de
this
violences
experience to
conjugales
strengthen the
en
safety of women
soutenant
victims of violence by
l'amélioration des pratiques
supporting
judiciaires.
the improvements of
Ensemble,
judicial practices.
elles œuvrent à la
Together,
transformation des systèmes
they're
judiciaires
working on
pour mieux
transforming the
protéger les
judicial
victimes de violences
system in order
conjugales
to better
et
protect
promouvoir des
victims of
changements
domestic
concrets
violence
dans la pratique
and to
judiciaire au
promote
Québec.
concrete changes in
Karine et
judicial
Marie-Jeanne,
practice in
la
Quebec.
parole est à vous.
Karine and Marie-Jeanne, the floor is yours.
Bonjour tout le monde,
Hello,
d'un côté à
everybody.
l'autre. C'est un
From coast to
privilège pour
coast,
nous,
it is
Marie-Jeanne et
a
moi, d'être
privilege
ici
for
avec
Marie-Jeanne and
vous
myself
cet
to be
après-midi
with
ou
you
ce
here
matin
this
dans
afternoon
les
or this morning,
Ontarien.
if you're in
Avant de
Western Canada.
commencer, on voudrait remercier
Before we begin,
sincèrement le
we
Learning
would
Network
sincerely like
et
to
Centre des
thank the Learning
connaissances
Network
pour l'invitation.
for the
Merci tout
invitation.
spécial à Sabri
We
et à Margarita
specifically
pour
like
la
to
coordination de
thank
l'événement
Margarita
d'aujourd'hui
and
et
Abri for
également aux
having
interprètes
extended that
qui font
invitation
un
to us. We'd
travail
also
fabuleux
like
pour
to
rendre
thank the
les
interpreters who do
connaissances
a wonderful
aussi accessibles
job
possible.
to make all of this
On
knowledge as
vous
accessible
parle
as possible.
aujourd'hui, on travaille en fait,
Today,
comme le
in
disait
fact,
Sabri,
as
pour le
Sabri
regroupement
said,
des maisons pour femmes
we
victimes de
work
violences
for
conjugales.
the
Juste pour
the
bien
group
ancrer les
of
choses, le
victims of
regroupement,
family violence.
en
This
fait, est composé
regroupement, as it's called,
de
this group
46 maisons
is
d'aide et
made up of
d'hébergement à travers la
46
province de Québec.
shelters and help
On
centers
représente,
throughout
grosso
Quebec.
modo, en fait, on
We
répond à
basically
environ 100 000,
represent
90 à 100
100
000
and
demandes d'aide
we respond
liées
to
à la
about
violence
100 to
conjugale par année.
180 calls due to
Environ
domestic
5 000
violence
demandes
every year, about
d'hébergement pour
5,000
les femmes et les enfants et
requests
plus
for
de 30
housing
000,
for
30
women and
000
children, and more than
demandes d'aide en
30,000
services externes
requests for
également
assistance
par année
in
au
external
Québec.
services
On
yearly in
salue
Quebec.
nos consoeurs aussi
We
qui
also
travaillent
like
dans les
to say
organismes
hi
d'aide et
to
d'hébergement
our
à travers
colleagues who
le
work in
Canada.
the shelters
On
across
va
Canada.
également utiliser un langage
As
genré
well, we'll
aujourd'hui
be
pour la
using a
présentation
gendered language for this presentation today. We'll be speaking about women who are victims, and we'll also be speak about perpetrators of violence more in the masculine terms. It doesn't mean that men cannot be victims of family violence. This does exist and they require resources, but the same is true for the LGBTQ plus community, which is also seeing family violence. So we use that language more because it The statistics show that in Canada, women are 8 times more likely than men to die from conjugal violence than men. As well, when it comes to coercive control, where it is criminalized in the country, men represent about 96% of the perpetrators of that violence. It's important for us. We're going to be speaking about coercive control. We're going to speak about the underlying theory as well as the practice, but it's key to also always speak to the victim's experiences. And today, from the outset, we wanted to speak about Sonia, who I've had an opportunity to meet. She was coming out of a very long and positive relationship, and that had changed. And she met a very charming man who was attentive, and he was the kind of lover who would put the towel in the dryer after she came out of her bath so that she would be comfortable. They saw each other for a while, then they moved far away from Montreal. They were some hundreds of kilometers away in a remote area. And they were also far away from Sonia's network, from her family. And bit by bit, as they were living together, certain rules came into play. And that either had to do with the environment or finances. And everything was going well until they had their first child. And things really started to change. Sonia had a number of pregnancies that were close together. She had to handle housework. She also had to do food shopping. She had to prepare meals. She also took care of the children. And if this wasn't in accordance with her partner's wishes, a conflict would break out. At a certain point, she was no longer able to go outside to have a coffee. Even using her own money, she was forced to stay home. And if she didn't obey the rules that her partner had established in the home, she no longer had access to the credit card. He refused. He did not allow her to take a warm bath or to buy new clothes for herself or the kids. He lowered the heat to 16 degrees during the night, during the winter time. Sonia's family was unable to come and visit her. Over time as well, there was physical violence committed. And what Sonia told us, that she was always afraid that her children would make too much noise, that they would be reprimanded by her partner. And he told her a crazy person, that she was ridiculous. He was constantly insulting her in front of the children. Then they were separated. He apparently went off to live with another person, and 1 month after the separation, one of the children of the couple had to call the emergency services because the father came to the house to get Sonia's cell phones, in which she had recorded information that she would be able to use for legal purposes to calculate the family allowances. And then Sonia had to call 911 when the husband came. So 4 years after the separation, whereas he hit Sonia with a car, there were witnesses. Sonia asked for an 810, that is to obtain protection, and some of the interveners in the criminal system said that she was crystallizing this post-separation conflicts. And 9 years later, with the children, Sonia once again closely missed being hit once again. Again, there was the terminology of separation, conflict, and was used by interveners, and that became recognition of post-separation violence. As Sonia was explaining, is that to this date, she no longer goes shopping for food in the village. She no longer jogs. She's always facing cars so that she can see exactly whether or not somebody's in there who might hit her. And she always says that in a number of houses, we teach our children to know what to do if ever a fire would to break out. We do this with children, and she said it at home. And children are taught to learn what to do if the father appears unannounced. So it is the mother of the children who will bring them outside of the house, and they'll hide next door. And Sonia says because of this that they have with the kids, and they have parental arrangements, because of this, she has received a life sentence, and she's now serving time. So for us, it's important to keep in mind the experiences of victims and the survivors to basically understand the concept of coercive control. And we'll be revisiting this. So our group began working on the coercive control notion more specifically in the fall of 2021. Some of you might have attended an event of called Femmes en Vie, Women Alive, back in 2019, where we brought together people from across the world to speak about coercive control in Montreal. As part of this, and as we noted also what women's experiences was, coercive control has been there for dozens of years. We started to work on a project which was funded by Health Canada, and in fact, we tried to focus on how we could integrate the notion of coercive control, whether or not there was criminalization of this in the future. And we wanted to concentrate on the essential character of this concept and how to document it. So basically, this was a 30-month project. So those of you who can calculate quickly, it ended in March 2024, and we're continuing with so we're also getting funding from a foundation and the victims and the justice system. So the idea was to look at how this plays out in the criminal justice systems. We are also working with patrols, we're working with police investigators, we're working with prosecutors, as well as family law lawyers, with the bench, and we're specifically focusing on the experience of women who are immigrants, who are new arrivals, as well as those who are in a financially precarious situation because they face some specific hindrances and there are specific strategies leveled against them in terms of coercive control. We also wanted to raise aware all of the players to this, the different manifestations of conjugal violence beyond physical violence. We also wanted to change some practices that are commonly deployed to provide better security, but to also ensure the freedom of the victims. So we began that work with an advisory committee. I know that some of you are listening to us, and I'd like to welcome you. It was absolutely key that we do this with our partners on the ground. So we're working with an advisory committee, which is made up of about 30 members and who represent this different chain of players. We have 5 of the 6 levels of service that exist in Quebec, as well as the police directors, the National Police School, the Ministry of Public Safety, both in terms of police practices and correctional services. We also have 2 university professors, 2 researchers from the Laurentian University in Sudbury, but also from New Brunswick. We also have the service which is called Rebuild, Rebâtir, which is free legal advice in Quebec for victims of conjugal violence and sexual violence. We also work with prosecutors and coordinators for conjugal or intimate partner violence. We also work with an association of lawyers. And of course, we also work with social workers from shelters. We also work from an organization of concerted work. So all of the partners come together to review high-risk cases. So this entire chain has its main duty to take stock of the situation. How has coercive control been understood, or perhaps not at all understood, and how is it integrated into practice? And to see with the various players, what are the actual constraints on the ground? What are the hindrances to better managing conjugal violence? We also identified good practices throughout Quebec and Canada as well as on an international level, which gave rise to a literature review, which was published in 2024. And we'll come back to this later on. Now, raising awareness of coercive control among judicial actors. This was done gradually, more specifically with the committee, and our concern was to develop a comfortable space. We wanted to create a space where people could speak openly about the areas where they're vulnerable, or what the challenges they face in their various organizations, and what we needed to focus on in our work. And essentially, this gave rise it led to a domino effect. We held 7 conferences. We were supposed to hold 7 conferences. We actually had more than 80 conferences. As Fabrici, we trained more than 6,000 actors, professionals, legal experts throughout Quebec and in Belgium as well. And the impact was to say that even though at this time there is no mid or long-term criminalization of coercive control, I think it's important for us to focus on this. And how to do this? Well, we developed a toolkit, once again, with the assistance of the advisory committee members, and we'll introduce them at the end of the conference. We also had training courses. There were 90 events that we organized from 2021 to 2024. And finally, in closing, we had regional seminars. It was essential for us to really place the know-how developed by all of the different players at the heart of our efforts, those who are experts in conjugal violence, more specifically, those from shelters, and we developed seminars. We held 10 regional seminars throughout the province of Quebec, where we had a case study in a team. That was an example. We also had discussion tables, which were made up of police, of members of correctional services, a number of different players, lawyers, prosecutors. We also had legal aid prosecutors. And the idea was to create a networking space, but also a forum for discussion where we could discuss everybody's needs. And then we were able to better draw ties between the various actors and to make sure that we all remain agile in our interactions. On that note, I'll turn it over to my colleague Marie-Jeanne to continue with the discussion.
Merci, Karine.
Thank you, Karine. So we are now going to move on to the more theoretical portion of coercive control. So the definition that we apply as part of our project, just mentioned by Karine, is as follows. So when we're speaking about coercive control, this is a series of intentional and repeated acts and strategies of violence that are gradually implemented by a partner or an ex-partner. So obviously, this covers the entire area of post-separation violence that Sonia just spoke to and that she talked to us about. These are not necessarily physical, but very often invisible, insidious. And the purpose is to isolate, control, and deprive the victim of her freedom. The individual who introduced this concept of coercive control is an American professor. He's called Devin Stark. He wrote a book on the topic in 2007. And he essentially said that all human beings have rights, fundamental rights and freedoms, the right to life, to liberty, to safety. And the victims of coercive control are deprived of these fundamental rights by their partners who take control over their lives. So when we're speaking about coercive control, we use this interchangeably with all of the vocabulary we use in conjugal violence. Both words can be used as part of this presentation. But it's also to indicate that the concept of coercive control enables us to establish a broader vision of conjugal violence. And this is what we started to identify early on in the year 2000.
Alors ici, une précision en lien avec la définition.
With respect to the definition, as I was mentioning, this concept enables us to take a broader view of IPV, of intimate partner violence, but it also enables to better grasp the complexity of the control dynamics in a relationship and highlights the insidious strategies used by a perpetrator. So as you saw in a previous slide, so coercive control might include physical violence strategies, but often the victims say it's a little bit like a spider's net that is being built bit by bit throughout the relationship. It doesn't happen overnight, and it's something that is developed in the partnership, and the other partner takes control of it. So it really is important to highlight all of the different components that in the past were not as much tied to IPV. So it is not a new form of intimate partner violence or domestic violence, nor a synonym of psychological violence, or it's also important not to confuse the notion of coercive control with a couple's quarrel or a severe separation conflict. Some of you, if you're familiar with family law or youth protection services, this is vocabulary that we often use. There's also often confusion with the notion of coercive control, nor is it a form of parental alienation. So truly, we're speaking about a concept that highlights the expanded aspect of domestic violence.
Ici, on vous présente les principales
So here you
manifestations
see
du contrôle
the main
coercitif et des
manifestations
exemples
of
qui sont
coercive
associés.
control
Il
with
s'agit d'un
examples.
outil qui a été développé dans
It's
le
a
cadre
tool
du
that was
projet dont
developed
Karine
as
vous a
part of
parlé
the
plus tôt.
project that Karine explained to us
C'est un
earlier.
outil, en fait, qui a été développé à la
This was a
demande des
tool that
partenaires
was
pour
developed at the
illustrer les
request
différentes
of the
stratégies qui
partners
peuvent
to
être mises en place
illustrate the various strategies that can be
justement
deployed
par les auteurs de violence et des
specifically
exemples pour
by
chacune des
the
catégories.
perpetrators of
Vous
violence.
voyez
And there are
11
different
catégories
categories.
sur
There are
l'outil.
11
Évidemment,
categories
ce ne
here
sont pas des
in the
catégories
tool.
qui sont
Obviously, these are not
exhaustives et
categories that
les
are
exemples qui
complete,
s'y trouvent ne le sont pas
and
non plus.
there
Mais c'est
are
pour vraiment
examples. They're
donner
not
une
all of the
idée
examples we
de
could
ce qui peut
cite,
être
but it's
utilisé
to give
dans
you
un
a sense of
contexte
what
de
kind of
contrôle
strategy
coercitif
can be
pour
used as part
justement
of
prendre le
coercive
contrôle,
control
priver la
to
partenaire de
take
sa
control
liberté.
over somebody and
Donc,
to
on
deprive
pense
a
à la
person of her
surveillance et à
liberty. For
l'interrogatoire.
example,
Donc,
it's
demander
monitoring and
à sa
interrogation. That is, he
partenaire
asks
avec
her
qui elle était,
who
où
she
elle était,
met,
ou
when,
l'accompagner dans
and
chacun de ses
why,
déplacements pour
and he
s'assurer qu'elle
wants
n'ait
to
pas
go
de
with her
contact
whenever
avec
she goes someplace else to make
des
sure that she
personnes du
has no
sexe opposé,
contact
par exemple.
with anybody else from the
Des
opposite
menaces.
sex.
On peut
Also, it's
penser évidemment aux
threats.
menaces
For
de causer la mort
example,
ou des
these
lésions
are
corporelles, mais
threats
aussi des
to
menaces
kill
de
and to harm
la faire
somebody
déporter dans le pays
physically, but
d'origine, des
also to
menaces de
leave with the
quitter avec
children,
les
arrange
enfants, de lui faire perdre la
to
garde.
take them elsewhere,
La violence
and to cause her
sexuelle,
to
on
lose
pense évidemment
custody.
à
There's
tout ce qui
sexual
touche aux
violence. This
agressions à
has
caractère
everything
sexuel,
having
mais
to do with
aussi
it.
de
Sexual
forcer sa
violence, but
partenaire
also
à
to forces
consulter,
the partner,
à
for
regarder de la
example, to
pornographie,
watch
pardon,
pornographic
contre
movies
son gré. On peut penser
against her
aussi
will.
à la
It
coercition
also
reproductive,
includes
donc de contrôler la
controlling birth
contraception,
control
les
and
grossesses de sa partenaire, que ce
pregnancies
soit en la forçant
of
à
the
poursuivre,
partners,
mener
that
à terme
is
une
to
grossesse
force
ou
her
en la
to carry
forçant
a pregnancy
à
to term
se
or
faire
to force her
avorter.
as well to
Le
abort.
détournement cognitif,
There's
en
also
anglais, on
gaslighting.
utilise le terme gaslighting. Donc vraiment, toutes les
So
stratégies, les
these are
tactiques qui
all
visent à
strategies and
venir semer un doute dans
tactics that
l'esprit
are
de sa
aimed
partenaire.
at
Donc, par exemple,
raising
la
doubt in the
frapper, elle a
partner,
une
that is
blessure, puis
to
par la
hit
suite,
her.
lui demander comment elle
She's
s'est fait
injured, then
ça.
ask her how she
Ça se
got
fait
hurt.
petit peu par petit
This
peu,
is
mais
done
ces
a little bit
stratégies-là
at
vont
a time,
vraiment
but these strategies
venir faire questionner en fait la personne, la
really
victime, sur
cause
sa
the
propre
victim
santé mentale, puis ça
to
fait en sorte que c'est beaucoup plus difficile par la suite
question
de
her
quitter
own
la
mental health,
relation
and
pour
afterwards
plusieurs
it's much
personnes.
harder for her to leave
La
the
violence
relationship.
économique, puis on
There's
inclut dans
also
cette
economic
catégorie le
violence, and
contrôle
this
des
category
ressources, donc tout
includes
ce
the
qui est
control
l'accès aux
of
cartes de
resources,
crédit, cartes de
everything involving
débit,
access
l'accès aux
to
finances en
credit, to bank
général,
cards,
mais
general
aussi
access
l'empêcher
to
d'avoir
finances,
accès
but also
aux
preventing
véhicules, par
her
exemple,
from
à la
accessing a
douche, au
car
lit
and from
conjugal,
taking a shower or the
à la
conjugal bed.
nourriture, donc de
Also
contrôler son
having access to
transport,
food, to
puis
control
de
her means of
menacer de la priver
transportation,
de biens
and
essentiels,
to
par exemple,
threaten
si elle
to
n'obéit pas aux
deprive her
réquisitions
of
imposés.
essential goods
La
if she
violence
doesn't obey the
spirituelle,
rules.
donc
There's
on inclut
spiritual
dans cette
violence.
catégorie toutes
So
les
this
stratégies
category
qui visent à
covers all
empêcher sa
possible
partenaire
strategy
de pratiquer
aimed
sa
at preventing
spiritualité ou sa
a partner
religion,
from
de la
practicing her
forcer à pratiquer
spirituality and
une
her religion, or
spiritualité ou
to
une
force
religion
her
qui
from
n'est pas la
practicing a
sienne, de se
specific
moquer des
religion or
rituels
spirituality
spirituels ou de
that's not
nier
her
ses
own, or to
croyances.
mocking her spiritual rituals or denying her beliefs.
L'isolement, une stratégie qui est
Isolation,
excessivement
it's
fréquente et
a
qui
very
fonctionne
common
généralement
strategy,
très
and I
bien
would say
parce
that
qu'une
it very
victime qui
well
est
works
isolée,
because the victim is
qui a plus
isolated.
son réseau autour
She
d'elle,
no
qui
longer
cesse de
can count on a
travailler, qui a plus
network
de
around
contact
her.
avec
She
sa
stops
famille.
working. She no longer
Généralement,
has
est
any
plus facile
contact
à
with her family.
contrôler
It's
pour
easier
l'auteur
to
de
control
violence.
her
Donc, on voyait dans
for
l'histoire de
the
Sonia, peu de temps
aggressor. We
après
saw that in
le début de la
Sonia's
relation,
story.
ils ont déménagé à
Very
plusieurs
shortly after
centaines
the
de
beginning of the
kilomètres
relationship, they
du
moved away
réseau de
hundreds of
Sonia.
kilometers away from
Donc, encore une fois, c'est quelque chose d'assez
Sonia's network.
fréquent,
Again, that
mais
happens
c'est
very
vraiment
often.
tout ce qui vise
But
à
again,
empêcher
this
la
is
victime
everything
à
that's
avoir des
aimed at
contacts avec
preventing the
ses
victim from
proches,
contacting her loved
l'empêcher,
ones,
comme je le
to
disais, de
prevent her, as I
travailler
mentioned, from
ou
working,
d'aller à l'école.
or to prevent her from going to
La
school.
violence physique, donc
There's
on peut
physical violence.
penser au fait de pousser,
This
frapper,
includes pushing,
étrangler,
hitting her,
cracher
strangling,
sur elle.
as well as
Le
spitting on the
blâme, donc
victim.
lui dire que
There's
c'est à cause d'elle
blaming,
qu'il n'est pas
saying
capable de
that it's
rester
because
sobre
of her that he
ou que
can't
si
remain
elle le
sober,
quitte, il va
or
mettre
if she
fin à ses
leaves him,
jours,
he'll
ça
kill
va être de sa
himself and
faute.
it'll be her fault.
L'abus via les
As
technologies,
well,
on voit
abuse
ça
using
évidemment, les
technologies.
technologies sont
Obviously, we see
omniprésentes dans
that
nos vies, puis c'est des stratégies
quite
qui
a
sont
lot
souvent
because
utilisées
technology is
justement, que ce
omnipresent in
soit
our
chez les
lives, and these
jeunes
are
ou les moins
strategies features that are
mais
often
ce sont des
deployed in
stratégies
younger or
qu'on
even
observe de
less
plus
younger
en plus
people, but this is
dans
something
les
that we're
dynamiques
seeing
du
more and more
contrôle
often.
coercitif. Donc, le
And
fait
it's coercive control. So, for
avec le mot de
instance,
passe de
the
sa partenaire
perpetrator
dans son
logs
compte pour
into her
contrôler les
account.
messages, lire les
He
messages,
reads her
confisquer son
messages.
téléphone,
He
ou
confiscates her
le
phone.
fait de suivre la
Or
victime
also,
avec des
she
applications
tracks text a victim with geolocation apps. Some victims found some air tags or geolocation apps in their devices, in the children's clothes, in the seams to see where she is as well. Often these have been found on vehicles. So this happens quite often. Humiliation, so to embarrass the victim, humiliate her, and to compare her physically to other people so that she becomes ashamed. And finally, harassment, the fact that he stalks her, he follows her, or he follows her to work, to where she studies, or to go around where she is, to also send harassing texts or emails, either directly or through somebody else. So that gives you a sense. But this is a 4-page tool, so there are even more examples here in the tool, on the paper version that you'll also find on our website. If not, as I indicated, in any case, these are not complete examples. They could be far broader than that. So here's an image of the iceberg to show what coercive control is. This was an image given to us by Dr. Cameron Gill, Canadian Police Chief Magazine. The idea is to show that often the part we see about coercive control is only the tip of the iceberg, that is the one sticking out of water. That's physical violence, fury, rage. In the past, we often thought that domestic violence was only physical violence, whereas it's much more complicated than that. And you have everything underneath the water level. It's much more difficult to identify and to detect, whether this be for legal actors or even for the victims. It's all about denigration, humiliation, gaslighting, financial violence, isolation. These are all strategies that are used and that are part and parcel of the dynamic of IPV, but often it's harder to see them from the outside. And it's for this reason that we believe that it's key to deliver this training to the interveners, to provide them with information about what coercive control really is. Because when you're aware, you're educated, and you are therefore more in a better position to really identify the dynamic.
Quelques statistiques simplement ici pour, Karine le disait, la raison pour laquelle
Karen was mentioning, the reason
un langage
why we use a language based on women and children is because they are in majority the victims. So 95% of victims of coercive control are women, according to a 2019 study, and in 45% of IPV situations, the perpetrator has also abused the children. So the children are more at risk of being abused, whether it's physically, sexually, or even to be killed. When it comes to specific vulnerabilities, it's important to say that there's not a typical profile of victims of IPV. It can happen to anyone, any woman.
Par rapport au salaire ou au statut.
We know it's not related to salary, to status, to origins, but there are still some factors of vulnerability that can be used by the perpetrator to have a greater control over the woman. For example, economic precarity or physical or functional limitation, marginalization, migration status. We can also talk about dependency. There are vulnerabilities that can be used by the perpetrator to control the victim, but IPV can happen to your sister, your neighbor, your daughter, your friend. So you really can't think that it will only happen to women who are in economic precarity who will be experiencing violence. Let's talk about impacts on the victims. You know, we have a short list here that we're sharing with you. But once again, it's not a complete list. So women experiencing IPV will experience many consequences in their life, as well as the children. So we're talking about chronic fear, hypervigilance, isolation, loss of confidence, loss of identity, powerlessness. So here we have a
où
quote
on
for you.
dit je n'existais plus, je savais plus ce
She
que j'aimais
said, I
manger, ce
didn't
que
exist
j'aimais
anymore. I
porter.
no longer
Ça
knew what
faisait
I
des
liked to
années
eat
que
or
je
wear.
n'avais
It had
plus
been
de
years
rêves
since
ou
I'd had any
d'aspirations.
dreams or
Donc,
aspirations.
évidemment, cette espèce de perte
So
d'identité
obviously,
se
this loss of
produit
identity,
graduellement au fur et à
this
mesure que la violence
happens
s'installe dans la
gradually over
relation, mais
time as
perdure
violence
même
settles
des
into the
années plus tard,
relationship, and it lasts even
même en contexte
years
post-séparation,
later,
les
even
conséquences
after
vont
the
perdurer. Donc, c'est vraiment
separation.
important de
So
garder
it's
ça
really
en tête et
important
de
to
ne
keep
pas
that in mind
minimiser les
and
impacts qui
to
sont
not
majeurs là, pour les
minimize these
victimes de
major
violences conjugales.
impacts on victims of IPV.
Un mot rapide aussi sur les
So
traumatismes
let's talk
crânio-cérébraux,
about
c'est
traumatic
important
brain
pour nous. On
injuries
en parle dans
quickly.
les
It's
formations qu'on
important for
donne,
us. We
mais
talk about it in
il y
the
a une
training
forte
courses we offer,
proportion de
but there's
victimes de
a
violences
big
conjugales qui
proportion
vont être à
of
risque de blessures au
IPV
cerveau. On parle de
survivors who have been
92%.
who have
Et
traumatic
c'est
brain
vraiment
injuries, so
les
TBIs.
blessures au cerveau, en
So
fait,
we're
ce que ça
talking about
fait,
92%.
c'est que ça va avoir des
So brain
conséquences
injuries have
importantes pour les
consequences
femmes. On peut parler
that are
de
pretty
perte de
major on women.
mémoire,
So
difficulté à se
basically,
concentrer,
memory loss,
épilepsie,
difficulty
maux de
concentrating,
tête, douleurs
epilepsy,
chroniques.
headaches, chronic
Souvent,
pain.
ces traumatismes
Often,
crânio-cérébraux vont
these
être causés soit
head
par un
traumas
choc ou
are
par
caused by
l'obstruction des voies
a
respiratoires.
shock
Ça
or
peut être en raison
by a blow
d'une
to the
situation
head or by
d'étranglement, par
obstructing the
exemple,
airway. So
mais
it could
seront
be
rarement
a choking, a
diagnostiqués si la
strangulation,
femme ne peut
but they're
consulter
not
immédiatement
diagnosed
un
often
médecin
unless the woman
à
can
l'urgence suite
consult with
à
the
la
doctor
situation
quickly in the
du choc à
emergency
la tête ou
services
l'étranglement.
right
Donc,
after
c'est
the
vraiment
situation.
peu documenté, ces
So it's
blessures au
not very
cerveau,
well
et ça fait en
documented.
sorte que quand les femmes vivent les
So
conséquences,
basically,
c'est
when
difficile
women
de
are
faire le lien
experiencing
avec l'historique de
consequences, it's
violence
hard to make a
qu'elle a
link
vécu.
between the
Évidemment,
violence
dans le
that she
processus
experienced
judiciaire, ça
and
peut avoir
the
des impacts
TBIs.
majeurs si on
Obviously,
pense à
they
la
can have a
capacité à se
major
concentrer ou à
impact
se
on
rappeler
the
dans un
court
ordre
process.
chronologique
For
des
example,
événements
if
qui
she
sont
has
survenus.
trouble
Ça va
remembering
avoir un
the
impact sur sa
chronology of the
crédibilité
events that
si la
happened to
victime
her, that
fait
could have an
preuve de
impact on her
confusion, par
credibility.
exemple. Donc,
If she looks
c'est
confused at
important d'être
trial,
sensibilisé.
it's
On
really
vous
important to
partage
be aware of
aussi
this.
en bas de diapositive
At the
le
bottom of the
SOAR Project,
slide, we are
une
sharing the
ressource
website soarproject.ca,
exceptionnelle là, qui a été
which
développée
is
en
an exceptional resource developed in British
par des
Columbia
chercheurs de l'université
by
Kelowna,
Kelowna
où il y a des
University
ressources en
researchers.
français et en
There's
anglais pour les gens
it contains
qui
resources
ont
in French
affaire
and
avec
English for
des victimes
people
de
who deal
traumatismes
with
crânio-cérébraux.
survivors
Donc,
of
des mesures
TBIs
qui
or
peuvent être
people
mises
who are
en place pour
women who are
justement
experiencing
adapter
TBI.
l'approche
So there's
et
measures
faire
that
en
you can
sorte
put in place to adapt your approach and
qu'elles soient bien accueillies, en
to
fait,
make
là, selon
sure
leur
that
situation.
the women are well taken care of based on their situation.
Au niveau des impacts sur l'enfant,
So let's talk
évidemment,
about
on a
impacts on
parlé
the
des
child.
impacts sur les femmes, mais
Obviously, we've
c'est
talked about
important
impacts
de
on women,
mentionner que
but it's
la
important to
littérature
mention
scientifique
that
est maintenant
scientific
très
literature
claire au
is
sujet
now very
à l'effet
clear.
que les enfants n'ont pas besoin d'être directement témoins
Children don't
de
need
la
to be a
violence pour
direct
subir des
witness to the
conséquences de la
violence
violence. Ils
in
sont
order to
maintenant
suffer the
considérés comme
consequences of
étant
the
des
violence.
co-victimes
They're
de
now
violences
considered as
conjugales à
being
part
co-victims
entière.
of IPV
Historiquement, on pensait que s'ils n'avaient
entirely.
pas été
So
témoins de violences
historically, we
physiques,
thought,
ils
if they hadn't
n'allaient pas
noticed it, if they hadn't been a witness to
subir de
it,
conséquences.
they
Par
wouldn't,
contre,
there wouldn't
il
be
ne faut
any
pas
consequences
sous-estimer
for
le
them.
fait que les
But
enfants
we
vont
can't
vivre dans un
underestimate the
climat de
fact that
tension qui va
that
affecter
the
leur
children will
bien-être.
live
Ils
in a
peuvent
climate
aussi
of
être la
tension
cible
that
des
affects their
règles, des
well-being.
restrictions mises
They
en
may be
place
the
par les auteurs
target
de
of rules and
violence. Ils peuvent
restrictions
être
put into
instrumentalisés
place
pour
by the
atteindre la mère
perpetrator. They
directement.
can be used
Et
to
l'auteur de
get
violence
to get at the mother.
peut faire obstacle à la
And as
relation
well, the
mère-enfant. Donc,
perpetrator may be
encore
a
une fois, ça
barrier
va
to the
avoir des
mother-child
répercussions sur
relationship,
l'enfant.
and this will
Ça peut être
have
d'empêcher l'enfant de
consequences for the
voir ses
child. For
grands-parents du
example,
côté
the child might not
maternel,
be
par
able to
exemple,
see his maternal
d'empêcher l'enfant
grandparents,
d'avoir
may
accès,
not be
de
able
voir ses
to
amis.
see their
Donc, il y a vraiment
friends.
des restrictions qui
So
peuvent
there's
viser les
really some
enfants directement
restrictions that can
si on ne
really
va
target
pas,
children
évidemment,
directly and,
jusqu'à la violence
impact them,
physique ou la violence sexuelle.
even
Puis,
if
si
we
ça
don't
vous
talk about
intéresse, on vous
physical and
invite à aller
sexual violence
consulter les
here. And
travaux
so
là, de
we're
Simon
inviting you
Lapierre, Isabelle
to
Côté
see the
et
work by
leurs
Isabelle
collaborateurs
Côté,
pour en
Simon
savoir plus
Lapierre,
sur
and
le sujet.
others to know more about this topic.
En résumé, le projet
So,
dont Karine
to
parlait,
summarize,
puis
the project
l'essentiel de
that
la
Karine talked
présentation
about and
aujourd'hui,
the basis of the
l'objectif,
presentation
c'est
today,
vraiment
the
d'atteindre un
objective for
changement
today
de
is really
paradigme. Donc, on veut
to
passer d'une
reach a
vision de la
paradigm
violence
change. We
conjugale qui
want
était
to move
centrée
from a view of
historiquement sur la
conjugal
violence
violence that
physique
focuses on
visible à
physical
une
violence
vision centrée sur
historically
l'éventail des
to a view of
stratégies
conjugal
invisibles de
violence that
prise de
focuses on the
contrôle de la
range of
victime.
invisible
Donc, tout ce qu'on va
strategies for
associer
taking
au
control of
schéma
the
de
victim. So
comportement de l'auteur de
everything that's
violence.
based on
On
the
parle d'isolement,
behavioral
de
pattern.
contrôle
So we're talking about
économique, de
isolation,
micromanipulation
economic
du
control,
quotidien.
micro regulations of the daily activities. We
We
also want to move from the search for isolated episodes or incidents, and we want to search for continuous and cumulative patterns of behavior. So we need to look at the history, understand what's happened during the relationship and even after the separation. We can't just rely on the fact that the woman was experienced one physical assault on October 3rd, but we really need to dig into everything to try and understand the dynamics and how that incident fits into that dynamic. Lastly, we want to move away from looking at the victim's reactions or lack thereof. So we need to stop asking, why did she stay? Why did she go back to her partner if she was experiencing violence? We want to move on to focusing on the perpetrator, his actions, and his underlying intentions.
On vous partage ici une réflexion qu'on trouve très intéressante.
Here's a reflection that we find quite interesting, and here it is. It is useful to invite legal professionals to consider the force with which the police and the courts would respond to someone who took a stranger hostage and strictly regulated how the person dressed, walked, talked, and spent their time or money. So basically, this draws a parallel with hostage taking from a stranger, but it really highlights the fact that there's a normalization that happens when it comes to a relationship and control in a relationship in comparison to when it happens with strangers, because in that case, it's perceived negatively and it's quickly taken care of. So this is really to bring people to think about the double standard that's in place. And also we want to try and minimize the normalization that's happening and that we're still seeing today.
Donc, on va passer à la section sur la violence post-séparation.
We're going to move on to post-separation violence and homicidal risk.
Ici, on vous partage une citation de Debache
So here's a quote from Debache and Debache.
On passe de la tentative de maintenir
So a strategy can change from attempting to keep a partner in the relationship to destroying them for leaving it. That comes with separation. So basically, the perpetrator decides that if he can't have her, no one can. So basically, there's a willingness there to destroy the person, and that can even lead to conjugal homicide. But you know, the perpetrator wants to take control, and at one point in the separation, he has the feeling that there's a loss of control, and at that point, that's the most dangerous point for the woman's life and the children's lives. So here are a few examples of post-separation violence. They're brought to light by SOS Violence Conjugale. So this list is by no means exhaustive, but you know, it can include repeatedly contacts her by phone, text, email, graffiti, or notes left on her car. He illegally breaks into her home and says he has the right to do so because he still owns the property. A woman told us that her partner entered her home illegally, and when the police arrived, he said, hey, she forgot to give him the health insurance card for the child, and the child had a medical appointment. So there's always some kind of justification behind the attentions, but obviously this is post-separation violence. He follows her in her car, he cuts her off. In his car, he cuts her off. And then there's a way he tries to control her through her parenting role. You know, with the children or the professionals that work with the family. He hides information related to the child. He manipulates the child to make sure that the child no longer wants to see the mother, for example. And the last one, this talks about all of the violence strategies used throughout the court process. So basically, he uses multiple legal actions, and the tribunals are recognizing this more and more, that this is a judicial violence strategy, but there's still a lot of work to be done. You know, he could basically make incessant claims for family law claims. He could contact the youth protection services. So really, he uses strategies to exhaust the victim, both financially and emotionally.
Ici, on vous présente quelques statistiques, en
So
fait,
here are a few
qui illustrent le
statistics,
lien étroit entre le
and they
contrôle
highlight
coercitif
the
et le
link
risque
between coercive
de
control
féminicide et de
and the
fibicide.
risk
Donc,
of
vraiment,
femicide
il
and
existe un
homicide.
lien très, très
So
clair entre la
there's a
présence de
very
contrôle
clear
coercitif
link
et le risque
between
pour
the
la vie des
two.
femmes et des enfants. Ici, il y a une étude du
So here,
Royaume-Uni qui
there's a
révélait que le
study in the
contrôle
United
coercitif
Kingdom
était
that
présent dans
reveals that
92% des
coercive control was
358
present
homicides
in
conjugaux
92% of
étudiés. Puis une étude
358
encore plus
homicides
récente en
studied in the
Australie qui
United
révélait
Kingdom.
que sur
And more
112
recently, a
homicides dans le
study
contexte
in
conjugal, le
Australia
contrôle coercitif
revealed that
était
over
présent
in
préalablement à
112
l'homicide dans
incidents,
111 des homicides,
there were
des situations. Donc
112
vraiment, c'est quelque chose
occurrences of
qui est
homicide. So this
omniprésent.
is really
Au
something that
Canada,
is
c'est en moyenne 75%
omnipresent in
des homicides
Canada.
conjugaux
In
qui vont
Canada, we can
avoir lieu
see that
alors que la
75% of
séparation était
domestic
imminente. Donc,
homicides
c'est la
happen
raison
as
pour laquelle
when separation
on
was
veut
imminent.
vraiment attirer votre attention sur
So
toute
we
la
really want to draw your
dangerosité
attention to the fact
liée à
that
la période de
there's a
séparation.
dangerous period linked to the
Une
separation.
statistique qui est liée, en fait, là, au
A
niveau
stat
canadien,
that
c'est dans le
is
bas. Donc, 60%
related to
des
Canada
filicides et des
shows that
féminicides
60%
surviennent
of
dans un
child and
contexte de
family homicides
séparation
occur in
ou
the
de
context of
litige autour de la garde
separation
des enfants.
or
Donc, ça,
custody
il y a
dispute.
un risque qui est très
So
clair là, pour la
there's
vie
a
des
very
enfants
clear risk
dans le
for the
contexte de
children's lives
séparation
in
ou de
the
litige autour de la garde.
separation context or
Il y a une
custody
étude
disputes.
américaine qui révélait
There's an
que
American
l'homicide ou
study
la
that revealed
tentative
that
d'homicide
homicide or
conjugal
attempted domestic
constituait le
homicide
premier événement de
constituted the
violence
first
physique pour
incident
cette
of
tiers
physical
des
violence for
victimes.
nearly
Donc, c'est
one-third
faux
of
de croire que
victims.
l'homicide ou la tentative
So
d'homicide
basically,
conjugal sera
homicide or
systématiquement
attempted
précédé
homicide
de violence physique. Pour
was
le tiers des
preceded
victimes, il n'y avait pas eu de
systematically by
violence physique
physical
au
violence.
préalable.
For
Par
one-third
contre, on
of them,
voit
there
que le
had been
contrôle
none.
coercitif
But
était
we also see
majoritairement
that
présent, donc il
coercive
faut faire
control
très
was
attention à
majorly
ça.
present, so we need to be
Et
careful with
finalement,
that.
20% des
And
victimes n'étaient
lastly,
pas les
20% of
partenaires
the
actuels
victims
ou
were
anciens, mais
not
d'autres membres de la
current or former
famille, des
partners, but
amis, des
other
collègues, des
family
policiers, des
members,
étrangers.
friends,
Donc, le risque
colleagues,
s'étend
police
au-delà
officers,
de
or
la
strangers. So
partenaire et des
basically,
enfants.
it goes beyond the partner and the
Puis, un
children.
mot très rapide sur le suicide forcé.
So
Donc,
quickly, when we talk
la
about
présence de contrôle
forced
coercitif
suicide,
peut conduire les victimes
coercive
au
control
suicide
can lead
forcé. Il y a une
victims to
statistique
forced
au
suicide. There's a
Royaume-Uni qui
statistic
révélait
in the
que ce
United
serait
Kingdom
entre
that
4
reveals
à
that
10
this
femmes qui
is between
se
4 to 10
suicideraient par
women
semaine en raison
who
de la
commit
violence
suicide
conjugale
every
vécue.
week due
Donc, c'est
to
un élément dont on parle très peu, mais
IPV.
c'est
So
vraiment quelque
it's not
chose
talked
qui
about
est
a lot,
important à
but
garder en
this is
tête
something
parce que,
important, and we
évidemment,
have
là,
to
ça
keep it in
augmente le
mind
niveau de
because
risque. C'est pas
obviously it
seulement
shows
en
the
contexte
level of
d'homicide
risk.
que les femmes
It's
meurent en
not
raison du
women
contrôle
aren't just dying
coercitif,
from
mais
homicide
ça
when
peut
it comes to
survenir aussi dans
coercive
une
control,
situation
but
de
also
suicide.
from suicide.
Quelques facteurs de risque
So
auxquels vous
here are a
pouvez être
few risk
attentif.
factors that we need to pay
Donc,
attention
encore
to.
une fois, on réitère, c'est pas parce qu'il n'y a pas de violence
So
physique
basically, it's
qu'il n'y a
not
pas
because
de
there's no
danger
physical
pour la
violence that
victime. Donc,
the
ça
situation
peut être
isn't
la
dangerous
perte
for the victim.
d'emprise
So there
pendant la
could be a loss
relation
of
ou
control during the
post-séparation.
relationship or after the separation.
Donc, le sentiment qu'il perd le
The
contrôle sur la
feeling
victime et
that
qu'il
he's
doit
losing
passer à
control over
l'acte.
the victim and
La
he needs to act.
séparation, la perte
There's the
d'espoir d'une reprise en
separation, the loss
relation ou
of
de la vie
hope of
familiale
resuming the
souhaitée. Ça
desired
peut
relationship
survenir
or
au
family
moment d'une décision
life.
finale
This
en
can
droit de la
come
famille ou lorsque la
when
victime va
there's the final
récupérer ses biens
decision is
personnels, par
made or when
exemple.
the victim
La
goes home to get
surveillance active, la jalousie
possessions. There
obsessionnelle,
could
la
be active
non-acceptation de l'arrivée
surveillance,
d'un nouveau conjoint, que ce soit
active
réel ou
surveillance,
imaginé.
obsessive
Donc, même si
jealousy,
madame n'a pas
the
de
failure
nouveau
to accept
conjoint,
the
des
arrival
fois,
of a new partner. And this is real or
si
imagined. Sometimes the
l'ex-partenaire
woman doesn't
s'imagine
have a new
qu'elle a
partner,
quelqu'un de
but
nouveau
if
dans sa vie,
the
ça peut être
ex-partner thinks
suffisant
that
pour
she
qu'elle
does, that
passe
could
à
be
l'acte.
enough for him
L'escalade de
to
la
act on
violence,
it.
encore une fois, on ne parle pas
The
uniquement de
violence can
violence physique, mais
escalate.
on
Here,
va
we're not
parler
talking
de
about physical
variation dans les
violence, but we're talking
manifestations,
about change in
l'aggravation, la
manifestations,
fréquence.
aggravation, frequency.
Le changement subi dans le
A
comportement de
sudden
l'auteur de
change in the
violence, donc
perpetrator's
lorsque la
behavior.
personne
So when the person
envoyait 250 messages textes
was
par jour,
sending
puis là, du jour au
200 text
lendemain,
messages a day, and then from one day
la
to the
victime n'a
other,
plus
oh,
aucune nouvelle. Des
there's no
fois,
more
ça peut
messages, no
être
more news.
un facteur de risque
That could be
à
a
vraiment
risk
ne pas
factor that we
négliger.
really need to pay attention to.
L'isolement de la victime et
Isolation
finalement
of the
la peur
victim,
de
and
la victime.
lastly,
Donc, une
the
victime qui
victim's
nomme qu'elle a
fear.
peur, c'est vraiment
So if the
quelque chose qui
victim
est
says she's
important
afraid, that's important.
à garder là, dans l'évaluation du
You
risque
need
global. Par contre, il y
to
a
make sure
certaines
you
victimes
take it
qui vont
into
nommer
account
qu'elles
in
n'ont
your
pas
overall
peur. Ça ne veut pas
assessment.
dire
Some
qu'il n'y a pas
victims
de
say they're not
risque,
afraid, and that
mais
doesn't mean there's no
c'est
risk.
évidemment là, un facteur de
But
risque important
obviously,
qu'il
this is an
ne
important
faut pas
risk
négliger.
factor that we have to take into account.
Donc, encore une fois, l'importance de
So
relier
once
tous les
again,
éléments
it's
ensemble. Je vous en
important to
parlais un
link
peu
all the
plus tôt
elements
dans la
together. I
diapositive
talked
sur
about
le
it a little
changement
bit
de
earlier earlier when I talked about changes in paradigm, but here we want to remember that in isolation, certain behaviors might appear less serious, but that it's by linking all of the facts and observations that we can identify a pattern of dangerous behavior.
Une section sur la criminalisation du contrôle coercitif.
Let's talk about criminalizing coercive control.
Il y a au
So, around the world, there's an international movement to criminalize coercive control. Several countries and states have already criminalized coercive control and criminalized coercive and controlling behavior. For example, England and Wales, 2015, the first really that made it an offense. And then there was Scotland, Ireland, a few states in the United States, and Australia since 2020. In Canada, the situation is changing, and right now changing quite quickly. So there were 3 private bills that were submitted, but the most recent one is C-332, which is at the second reading in Senate, and all of the parties have adopted it unanimously in the House of Commons. So there's really a will from all parties to criminalize it. We're just not sure how to do it. So there's work being done currently on that front. So contributions of criminalization in Canadian criminal law. And when Karine will present the tools, you'll see that we have done work on this aspect. And if you're interested in knowing more, there's more readings you can do. So this would help recognize the victim's experience as a whole, going beyond physical violence and the search for isolated incidents. It would enable legal professionals to break the cycle of violence earlier and to establish a safety net, because the legal professionals are able to detect the presence of coercive control. It would make a powerful symbolic gesture to show that these socially unacceptable behaviors are taken seriously. It would act as a deterrent, hopefully, to perpetrators of violence. And lastly, it would educate victims, the public, and the justice system stakeholders about coercive and controlling behaviors. So basically, we would be showing the whole iceberg that I showed you earlier. So pending criminalization, why is it important to document the presence of coercive control? And this should be done by the public. So distinguish between IPV and marital quarrels. It helps to prevent recurrence and escalation of violence. It helps to quickly establish a safety net, physical as well as psychological, around the victim and her children. And it makes it easier for policemen, for example, to decide whether to arrest, detain, or release the aggressor. It makes it possible to support a greater number of applicable offenses. You know, if we're talking about the prosecutor's work, they have access to the whole relationship, and it enables a better overall risk assessment by all players in the chain who are informed of the behavior patterns and are aware of the level of danger.
Donc, on parlait ici... Oui, Karine?
Je ne sais pas si vous voulez que je prenne la relève pour la suite.
Did you want me to take over for this one?
Pardon, il me manquait une diapositive.
Sorry, I'm missing a slide here.
C'est parfait. Un travail d'équipe. On se tend le témoin. Alors, pour maintenant qu'on a parlé du concept,
so now that we've talked about
en fait, c'est quoi le contrôle coercitif,
what is coercive control, how does it manifest, it's important that professionals are able to detect it more easily. So it's one thing to understand it, it's another thing to recognize it and reveal it. So Marie-Jeanne just mentioned that one of the advantages of looking into coercive control is to be able to distinguish, I don't know how it works in your regions, what the terminology is, but basically to distinguish between couple quarrel, couple dispute, couple strife, and conjugal violence. So Hélène Pence used Dulut's model to suggest 3 elements to look at. Firstly, are we facing a pattern of behavior? So is it repeated? Will it affect various spheres of the victim's life, or is it in one sphere done continuously? Secondly, does the victim change her habits and choices as a result of the pattern of behavior? So for example, you know, if you're in front of a woman who has stopped seeing her friends, who's left work, who used to eat a certain way but's changed it now, who used to dress a certain way and dresses differently now, You know, does she have less access to cell phones? Does she not have money to go out? And is there a fear? Does she fear the consequences of this pattern? So is she afraid of consequences, whether they be physical or psychological? You know, we were saying earlier that physical violence can be part of the manifestations, but it's as if the perpetrator has a toolbox. So sometimes he'll use one tool only as long as it works, but then if that one doesn't work anymore, well then, he'll use another one. So is the victim afraid psychologically for herself, for her children, or for her loved ones when these pattern of behaviors are in place? So when you see those kinds of criteria, you're most likely in front of IPV, not couples quarrel. So we were talking about interveners that work with perpetrators. There are certain characteristics that return, that are recurrent. Let's remember that there's no profile set for perpetrators. As Marie-Jeanne was saying, you know, for the victim, it can happen to anyone. Well, it's the same thing for perpetrators. What's going on in France? We can see it with the 50 co-accused. They all have a different profile. They're Mr. Everyone. And here we're seeing a context of sexual violence and IPV. So, you know, Marie-Jeanne gave examples of justifications. You know, for example, yes, I have the key because my partner or my lover needs me to because, or because I drive her to all of her appointments because she has a tendency to get lost or she's nervous in the car, she can't drive. So there's always a justification, a comment that comes to justify some of the strategies used for surveilling the victim. So he answers on behalf of the victim. You know, it's not all legal professionals that see both at the same time. So for example, social services, health services, you know, I worked for a community organization. So sometimes I had access to both in interviews, both of the couple. So we have a perpetrator who will speak quite often. And when the woman wants to talk, she might look away. She'll want to validate what she's going to say between between revealing her thought. The perpetrator will show impatience. So what we've been told is that, you know, during an interview or a meeting, there's an agenda that's quite ready, that'll cover certain points. But sometimes the perpetrator wants to go out. He wants to take over the control of the conversation. He wants to share what he wants to share. And if we try and bring him back to what the expectations were, well, then we'll see him become impatient. On the opposite, he could have a surprisingly calm attitude. For example, you know, when the police comes and when there's a police intervention, you know, a policeman arrive and, you know, something obviously happened. The victim could be crying, she could be screaming, she could seem disorganized, panicked. And the partner seems quite calm. He says, no, she's the one that got anxious. Nothing happened. She's not well. So he basically controls the situation. He controls the exchanges. He could have good reasons, good excuses. He seems very coherent, you know, and let's go back to those TBIs, those brain injuries that can have an impact on the victim's attitude. But since he doesn't have a TBI, he appears very calm. So we have to be careful with the image that's projected. And then an attempt to build alliances. We see it especially with male policemen. You know, perpetrators say, hey, you know how women are, you know, it's that time of the month, you know, she's too sensitive, she has no sense of humor. And when it comes to a female intervener, one woman told us that in her office, there's a man that came, that looked at a frame of her hiking and said, hey, you like hiking? So he tried to basically make a connection with her. So the man will try to make alliances with the legal professionals. Lastly, he discredits the victim. So basically, he'll draw attention to the mental health issues, to the dependency issues, to saying that she's not a good mother, to saying, well, if it was that bad, she would have left. So basically, he casts a shadow on her credibility. And this is quite present when it comes to IPV. So what are the signs of coercive control in a victim? Well, here, I want to warn you, as Marie-Jeanne said, nobody's excluded. Nobody can say that they're completely immune to experiencing IPV. So here, really, it's about talking about situations where we're inviting legal professionals to pay attention. So, for example, if a woman is especially isolated, has little or few friends, doesn't have access to resources, doesn't take part in francization course or English learning courses, he speaks English or French, she can't read or understand documents. She won't necessarily know what resources are at her disposal in the community. She won't have access to credit cards, to the house key, to banking accounts. She won't have access to a telephone. So all of those little signs, what police have told us is that when they come and to intervene, he has the health insurance card, the passport, all of the identity documents of the woman. So these are clues that invite legal professionals to dig deeper. So documenting the patterns of behavior, as we said, it doesn't happen on a specific day. You know, a prosecutor in Belgium was saying it's not a picture. It's a film when it comes to coercive control and physical violence with IPV. So we have to look at the context. What's the history? But beyond that, let's look. What are these changes in strategy that can be used by the author? You know, I come back to the toolbox, you know, to say, well, before he would use the hammer, now he's using the hammer, the saw, and the wrench. So it's about seeing, are we in a situation that is intensifying? And really, we want to be analyzing the level of danger of a femicide or a homicide. We don't also want to look at criminalized manifestations. Sure, as we've said, some acts can be criminalized, but others are just as dangerous, so they need to be documented. We need to pay attention to them. If there's a change in frequency, if there's a change in intensification of the tactics, and also looking at the reactions of the victim, but also, you know, remembering that she could be quite resilient, and in order to survive, she might look hostile to intervention, especially to police, but really to focus on the acts, the perpetrator's acts. We also need to pay attention when we have a perpetrator who might have good explanations, who could be charismatic. Let's not hesitate to dig deeper. It's important to document the impacts on the victim. You know, we need to acknowledge her feelings of immediate or chronic fear. The victims are hypervigilant, as we've said. Sonia, in her story, said that when it came to doing groceries, to walking, she's always hypervigilant. We have to consider the trauma because, unfortunately, that will have an impact on the perception of credibility, as we've explained earlier. We need to think about the cumulative impact on her and the children. And, you know, in some of our exchanges with women, they've told us, you know, when I was following the rules, if I was doing what was asked, everything went well. But it's to say, well, what happens when you want to go out? Or when you disagree with something? Or you want to start going out with friends again? What happens then? So we really need to dig into that aspect. And we also need to look at potential risks for safety.
Now, knowing how to be, knowing what to do, and you might have mastered some of these techniques, but not so much the case for others. So let the victim know that the violence is never acceptable and she's not responsible. If there is gaslighting again, she might blame herself and say, well, she didn't follow the rules, she didn't stay in her bubble, she put pressure on him, he was in a hurry and she should have given him more time. So also verbalize when you see something that worries you. Because again, we have to respect the victims all the time, but we also have to point out when something worries us. And often they say, the women said, look, I didn't dare to cut him off. I think nobody would believe me. I've never been hit. I've never had any blues and any bruises. So again, respect her pace, and also use an interpreter. When you have the resources, when these are available, try and get them, because when you're not speaking in your mother tongue, you don't understand usage, some nuances might get lost, it might be difficult and intimidating to speak. It's important to get assistance. Also be aware of your own limits, because we wouldn't be prosecutors, police officers, as well as social workers, all alone there. We need to work together. Again, we carry the flame, Marie-Jeanne and I. We want to make sure that there's a continuum of services available, again, with specialized services, of course, for shelters. But for example, when you are working with somebody who is in a financially difficult situation, you need to recognize this. Also with immigrant women, you have to be familiar with the local resources. And of course, it's always important to work in a network with the victim. There is no such thing as a useless intervention. Again, you might be working with the police, but if there has been no report to the police, it would be time to create a relationship of trust and to refer the victim to the available resources. So we're reaching the end as well. Validating, what are the key phrases? Okay, again, repeat the impact that knowing how to be might have. Sometimes the victim might not be worried about the relationship now, but she might never leave also. But it's important when professionals and interveners say something, this should have an impact. Somebody will contact them. For example, some people call women, tell us that even when there was an officer on patrol, has had an impact on her. And 2 years later, she said that she launched a legal process. But she told me that it was because of this police officer, because of what he said to her, that helped her. So the lack of judgment, saying that when she's ready, we'll be there and we're going to respect her pace is important. It's important also to use the right words. She shouldn't blame herself for staying in the relationship. She took the best possible decision on the basis of the information she had in that situation. We have to tell her that her reactions are normal. So again, to remove pressure from her and that many victims share. And again, the language of some professionals isn't always adapted and aligned on that context. And people will also be developing their own reflexes. Now, a few words about available shelters. You all know how important it is to really refer somebody to resources and indicate that it's free, it's confidential. The shelter is open 24 hours, 7 days a week. There are also outside services that are available at many shelters. So we need to validate her feeling and again explain that there is assistance there, and she could also obtain assistance for housing as well as for legal assistance. So it's important to know this, and that many resources will also come to support professionals who may have questions, whether this be about a specific concern on safety. They will be able to assess the risk, or as well in how to act with persons who will be working with the victims. So before I close, just a few words on the impacts of collaboration between the social judicial players. It's really important beyond criminalizing. It's important to really have a common language and understanding of coercive control, to have the same prism, the same view of the concept. Again, in Quebec, we're currently seeing change, and people now better understand this, and they better also recognize the risks that are involved in coercive control. And it's important to have a continuum of documents. So when all of the legal professionals are involved, it enables a lot of note-taking and to putting together different parts of the puzzle to respond to the victim's situation. It's also important to highlight strategies, more specifically in the legal system, We know that it's important that other players in the field are made aware, whether it be in immigration, family law, and this will shed a different type of light on the actions taken by the perpetrator. Again, it's important to have increased vigilance over the dangerousness of behavioral patterns. It really takes a village to raise a child, but a village, a community of legal professionals will come to support everybody in the roles that they play to help the victims. It will also help the victim when it's a difficult time, and it will help to keep her informed. That's also very important to enhance visibility. It's something that we always need to keep in mind. So that closes our presentation. Before we move on to the Q&A, we're going to speak about the tools that we developed in our project. So you'll be able to find all of these tools developed on our group's site, on the regroupement site, as well as the site for women victims of IPV. It's in English. We have a last one in English. That's for corrections. That's currently being translated into English. It's all free. You can upload these in both languages. One of the tools speaks to what coercive control is, and it covers the different manifestations that what Marie-Jeanne spoke to us about, and how coercive control is manifested. Now we also have tool number 2, which addresses more documentation and identifying coercive control. A police officer isn't going to document it. They don't have the same means of working as an immigration lawyer would, for instance. The idea is to really provide all of the professionals with a toolbox that respects their own fields of practice. We also have probation officers, for instance, that were interested in this. So we have this new tool available. We also have one for immigration, that is defending immigrant women. We also have one for defending women's situations of economic precariousness and coercive control. That's a guide for lawyers. And we have tool number 3, which will cover the risk of homicide. And Marie-Jeanne and myself and another colleague also sit on the Canadian Heads of Police Association. And in the UK, it's already been well documented. It's been identified that there is a very strong correlation between coercive control and the homicidal risk. So the idea is to shed light on this concept. And again, it's depriving somebody of freedom. That should be enough of a factor. But the systems obviously need to take this into account. But there is a danger for the safety of the victim and the children. And again, these are important drivers as well. So the literature review, we spoke about it at the beginning, and this was published in 2022. It's also available online. So this is an inventory of what was available at the time, and the idea is to explore existing practices in different areas of law, such as criminal law, family law, and immigration law. And there's a booklet as well for women, for the actual survivors. Initially, the project was really addressed to legal professionals, but this was drafted in another context. And this booklet, as you can see here, doesn't speak about IPV. A number of women told us that conjugal violence, or IPV, was very confrontational for them. So it really referred to physical violence. They weren't subjected to physical violence, for example. But so we've gone ahead with providing explanations, the manifestations, how certain relationships may be under coercive control. Again, the idea is to refer them to resources about IPV. And something that should be noted, that if they launch a legal proceeding, they, of course, might be facing legal issues, and there is also conjugal violence that's a risk here. So before I thank you, allow me to close to speak about a tool we haven't yet shown. and it's a pamphlet for the police. And I'm sorry, I don't have this on screen, but it's the members of the advisory committee from police organizations work with us. So in some police stations, and I don't know how this works in other provinces in Canada, but in Quebec, we already had poster about narcotics, about guns, etc. So we were wondering why not have something on IPV and coercive controls. So we also developed a placeholder that's now available in all of the police stations in Quebec to enhance the referrals and also to allow police officers to take better action and to also help the work of the other professionals, especially legal professionals. So that is the closing of our presentation. I think we're a bit longer than we expected to be. Sabri, sorry, but I do think that we'll have 20 minutes left for the Q&A. Thank you very much, Karine and Marie-Jeanne, for this very rich and detailed presentation. Thank you as well as having made the focal point people's lived experience and how we can operationalize the change in paradigm that we need to see in coercive control in the context of IPV. So we have a number of questions in our Q&A. So let's begin. We have a question. So how do you think that criminalizing coercive control will counter a potential rise in this? So in other words, how can we be sure that legislative action against coercive control won't be used against the victims and the survivors? Marie, do you want me to answer that question or do you want to go ahead? That's a very good question. In fact, it's been a concern raised in Scotland and in the UK as they were working on criminalizing as well. The key over there was to analyze the main perpetrator. We're also trying to promote this. We're trying to put that forward here in Quebec and across Canada if ever criminalization goes ahead. But all of the players in the UK and Scotland told us that in criminal law, this did not come to fruition. So what police officers told us is on the one hand, when we understand that coercive control is a pattern, that it leaves a trace, that it leaves evidence, is that this not as visible when it's an isolated incident, when you're looking at it through the prism of physical violence, when somebody said, I was pushed, I was hit, compared to when we look at patterns of control, of humiliation, etc. There aren't any. So the idea is to enable prosecutors and police, at least in Quebec, to focus on this. Here we do have a directive to analyze the main perpetrator. So we do this upstream that the police has to document the incidents, that is, who's doing what, beyond who called the police, who might have pushed the first time around. The idea is to truly document the history of the relationship. So both from the points of view of police, of researchers, of prosecutors and victims' aid organizations in the UK and Scotland, they told us that because they had given thought to firstly identifying the main perpetrator, and that was at the very heart of the training that they delivered on criminalizing, and this did not play out. As well, they worked with Johnson and Myhill researchers in the United States and in the UK to see whether there were certain groups that have been identified and that were perhaps condemned for coercive control. So really they were below the threshold that they had identified as being required. So Marie-Jeanne, I don't know if you want to add something to that. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm going to ask now the next question. This was submitted by one of our attendees. A lawyer I was chatting with recently stated that the term violence should not be used in a legal context, except strictly in terms of physical violence, that to do otherwise causes the judge to dismiss or disregard the statement's validity. So that sounds like they cannot use the term psychological or emotional violence in a court context, that someone can say there was or was not violence, if not physical, but can only say abuse for the rest. And that is often viewed as lesser in many ways. Could you clarify how that works within a court or legal context?
C'est intéressant, en fait. Puis là, je pense qu'il y a aussi un enjeu de linguistique.
That's interesting because I think there's also a language, a linguistic thing aspect here. So we've heard of domestic abuse, domestic violence in English. So I know that, at school, if we talk about domestic abuse, family abuse, that varies. But in Quebec, I can only talk about what we know here, but in Quebec, the term violence can be used in other contexts. We had a judgment last fall that talked about judicial violence. So it's a female judge who really recognized in a coercive control framework within IPV that there was abusive procedure from the ex-partner. She really named it judicial violence. So it's clear that there's some education that needs to be done when we talk about violence, when we talk about IPV or conjugal violence, when it comes to the judges, the lawyers can really see it very narrowly as in only physical violence. And Marie-Jeanne, you might want to add something here, but when we go beyond psychological violence, verbal violence, when we talk about concrete strategies, tactics, manipulations, gestures, actions, we really enlighten the court with what was put in place. It's basically a web that are imprisoning the victim. So it might not be the terminology broadly, but really the highlighting of the various tactics. And when we can really understand that pattern, I think it's easier. And I hope that we won't trip up on the words and really look at the intentions and look at the impacts on the victims. Marie-Jeanne, do you have anything to add? Well, what I heard in that question, and I agree with you, Karine, I think that in the translation there's something with the terms that are had, but basically what you're saying is that there's a lot of work to be done when it comes to normalizing what isn't, to putting a term around what's not physical violence and removing the parallels between, or the associations between physical violence and IPV, that it's more. And I know that there was another question, in the conversation, there was a participant saying that coercive control was associated with psychological violence. So at the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned that psychological violence is not coercive control. What I meant is that coercive control is basically like a large umbrella that integrates psychological violence, stalking. But basically, it's a broad vision and it integrates physical violence. So it's all the strategies that are used by the perpetrator, and that can work in order to reach the partner. So maybe in court, the words coercive control might allow one to unravel all of these issues, but I think there's a lot of educational work to be done at in this regard. Thank you for your answers. So a participant asked if judicial violence was going to be added to the list under that umbrella. So that brings me to another question, and it concerns assessment tools. What assessment tools are used to assess homicidal risk in Quebec? The person mentions assessment, danger assessment by Campbell. Can you talk about what's used in Quebec? The answer, yes. The danger assessment, as far as I know, is not used in Quebec. We know about it, but through other sources. There's no uniform grid that all the legal professionals in Quebec use. So there are some, for example, VGVC, VG-V-C, which was developed with the Safety Hub on IPV that's used by several regions and partners. We also talked about concerted action cells. So if partners fear for their safety or for if someone fears for the life of of a victim, well, this group will meet, have discussions, and when it reaches a certain ceiling, well, then at that point they trigger a deeper analysis and actions. So when it comes to the police force, during their interventions, they don't formally assess risk. So in Quebec, they work with a guidebook to prevent partner homicides, and that's mandatory for the whole police force in Quebec. But this is not an assessment tool for risk. It's really items to take into account, warning signs, to guide them in their interventions, to see if they should be worried. Are they facing a moderate risk or an imminent risk? And then they can act in consequence. So basically, if there's a chance of choking, but there's nothing that's there for broadly for all of the players. You know, in Canada, we talk about ODARA in English, Canada, be safer. The notion of coercive control is presented in various ways as well. We really like what's been done in England. There was DASH, D-A-S-H, and now they've developed the DARA, D-A-R-A, which is not to be confused with ODARA. So ODARA is currently being tested and is used by 3 police forces in England. And it helps to diminish the officer effect, if you will. So basically what we've been told, especially in Great Britain, is that the questionnaire will only be as good as the person's understanding of it who's asking the questions. So obviously, training is essential. So the DARA tries to reduce that officer effect, which has been documented by N.D. Mahill from the College of Policing. But we don't have a uniform tool everywhere in Canada. Ideally, the risk assessment tools would have to take into account at a greater scale the manifestations of coercive control. Marie-Jeanne? Anything to add?
Okay, I'll move us on then to the next question. Thank you, Karine. Someone asked, can you please comment on forced suicide post-separation, often exacerbated by the family court system and the people that are supposed to see, hear, validate coercive control, lawyers, custody assessors, police, judges, child protection workers, etc., which lead the survivor of violence feeling even more socially isolated and completely alone. And she thinks that suicide is the only way out. If she ends up taking her life, is it documented as domestic homicide? If coercive control is legalized in Canada, would that death become a criminal offense?
C'est très intéressant. Je ne sais pas, Marie-Jeanne, veux-tu commencer ou
Very interesting. Marie-Jeanne, would you like to start this time? No, go ahead.
En fait, pour tout le Canada, je ne sais pas.
So for all of Canada,
je pense que c'est quand même peu documenté au Canada.
I don't think it's very well documented in Canada. There's work being done in Europe, especially in France and in the UK. So there are campaigns in both. For example, Jane Monkton Smith, who's been working in England on that question. Same thing in France. It's highly documented. It's an offense when there's a forced suicide, when there's a moral deterioration that can lead to that. So in Quebec, there's a voice that's pushing for this. And you know, you were asking about after separation, but we also are finding this during the relationship.
Donc la documentation, je pense qu'il y a des efforts à savoir comment est-ce que
that there's some efforts being made to know how to recognize it, knowing that the rate of prevalence in forced suicide is quite high in these cases, so is depression. But how do we document it? How do we document the effect when there's a suicide? So we have to know, firstly, that there's a red flag because it's in a IPV context, because the people around her might not know about it. But there's also the death examination committee that is trying to look into that and figure out how to document it. But it has to be, a light has to be shed on it. You know, previously interveners didn't necessarily see it. When they weren't confronted to physical violence, they couldn't understand that there was actually intimate partner violence happening. So there needs to be this awareness, education, so that more people can say, yeah, you know, when this woman died, she was in an IPV situation, even if there wasn't physical violence. And we're able to take that into our calculations. So I'm not a criminalist or a prosecutor, but when we're talking about criminalizing coercive control, it won't be dependent on whether there's a suicide following it or not. You know, there'll be an impact, but it's not an offense in and of itself. You know, the question of forced suicide in Canada, and it's not really being looked at as that. But I just want to draw your attention to the work that has been done in France and in England on this particular topic. And I would even say that they're looking into accidental deaths. England is looking at deaths by overdose, by strangling, consensual sexual strangling, by traveling, etc. So Jen Monkton-Smith is a professor, and she tries to say that when they know there's been IPV, they need to start from the point that they might be confronted to a domestic homicide. And if that's not the case, then they need to try and preserve the evidence to really analyze what could have happened, even though there's been justifications and explanations with the first meetings with the police officers. Marie-Jeanne, I would add quickly that in the criminal code currently, there's an offense that prevents inviting to suicide, but there has to be a link made between involuntary homicide and forced suicide. We have a lot to learn from other countries because, as Karine mentioned, that we're not able to dig into the woman's history and really make a link, draw a link with everything. So we're quite far from what needs to be done, but there is some reflection happening in Canada to figure out how to get information from the research that's currently being done in Europe. Thank you. Thank you for all your answers. And the reference from France is Emilou, who's a lawyer who worked on forced suicide. So we're out of time for today. Thank you so much to Karine Barrette and Marie-Jeanne for joining us, and to all the webinar participants. Thank you to our interpreters, Sylvie Rodrigue, Caroline Schutze, as well as our ASL interpreter, Aileen Edrich, Cindy Muscat, and to our LSQ interpreters, Joël Fortin and Marie-Jacques Tremblay. Please note that once the webinar is over, there will be an assessment survey sent to your browser. Please fill it in to receive a participation certificate. Thank you, everyone. And on behalf of the Learning Network and the Knowledge Hub, goodbye.